Your Excellency, thank you so much for joining CNBC. We're excited to have you. I want to kick off by asking you to address for us what's happening at the moment with Libya. We understand that there was just a meeting of the Arab League. How concerned are you that Turkey is taking unilateral action here?
Well, Libya, I think, is at the forefront of regional issues right now. There's a lot of interest in Libya, and that interest, expands really several regions. It's Arab interest, African interest, European interest, and so on and so forth. I think we're very concerned. We're very concerned because today, I think the priority is to try and save lives. And as Turkish and militia forces and Syrian mercenaries are about to attack the city of Sirte, 60,000 civilians are trapped in that city. And I think what we have seen in Libya over the last 9 years, really a pendulum between the West, the part forces of Libya controlling the majority of Libya, and then the pendulum swinging towards the eastern part forces of Libya. I think the conclusion in all this is that we do need to move very quickly to a comprehensive ceasefire and to re-engage politically, because clearly we're very convinced that in Libya there is no military solution. Now, the Arab League, I think, has come out with a very strong resolution condemning the presence of foreign forces in Libya, asking for a ceasefire and asking for the ejection of mercenaries out of Libya and for return to the political process. Where we are currently is engaging Turkey, which is aggressively actually moving on in several Arab countries, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, various other Arab countries. So we have Turkey trying to lay claim here to a geopolitical position in Libya. And, the Egyptians, on the other hand, are very concerned about developments. And President Sisi, in a landmark speech in Sidi Barrani a couple of days ago, has basically identified what he had called red lines. And this is Sirte and Al-Jafra. So we are really at the cusp of a regional confrontation, which we need to avoid at all costs. We need also to ensure that the diplomatic efforts, whether these are European, whether these are Arab, whether they are from the United States and others, African, should really be successful in first of all averting this confrontation over Sirte, and then leading to a ceasefire, and then to a longer term and sustainable political solution in Libya.
Your Excellency, this area surrounding Sirte controls essentially 80% of Libya's total oil wealth. How much do you believe is a motivation when we come to Turkey fueled by their ambitions to have control over that oil?
Well, it's always speculative, but I think the Turks are basically trying to achieve several things. They are trying to establish a foothold in a wealthy Arab country such as Libya, and we've seen that in other Arab areas. And this is, sort of a geostrategic positioning of Turkey as a regional power. But the problem is that
they've tried that one before, haven't they?
Yes, and I think this is continued, and I would argue that this is actually not the right approach for Turkey to establish fruitful and friendly relationships with the Arab world. As we all know, the Arab regional order is going through a very difficult period. And I think countries such as Turkey and Iran should respect, and Israel also, should respect also the vulnerabilities they see in their what is essentially their neighborhood, and should not try and exploit it. And what we are really seeing is an exploitation really of this. I think other than that, the Turks also somehow with the AKP, somehow they are not comfortable in the size of their nation state. And they hark back to their, sort of imperialist ambitions of past Ottoman empire and so on and so forth. But realistically, I would argue that time will tell that this is not how you really build a solid and fruitful relationship for a country that is as important and as dynamic really for the region. And I think from that perspective, I would say that this is an overextended policy that will actually hurt Turkey if it continues.
Your Excellency, the UAE controls over $1 trillion across its sovereign wealth funds. You have 6% of the world's proven oil reserves. And my daddy always used to say that whoever has the gold makes the rules. How do you respond to those who would suggest that the UAE's foreign policy has an agenda?
Well, again, I mean, agenda is correct, but not in a devious way. I think, first of all, we should, when you mentioned these numbers, I think we're very cognizant that we should not suffer from any sort of hubris here. I think this is something essential. So the UAE's foreign policy, I think, clearly recognizes that this is a different international system. And a different international system will require the UAE and other regional players to take more responsibility for this prosperity and stability of their region. But the other also component of the UAE's foreign policy is to understand that this cannot be done alone. You have to work in tandem with friends and allies. So clearly, when we are concerned about the stability and prosperity of the Arab world, we don't work alone. We don't have the size, we don't have the political gravitas to work alone. So the important part here is to work with allies. Within an Arab context, we see, for example, working with Egypt, working with Saudi Arabia, with other countries such as Jordan and Morocco and Algeria and others, very essential. We see this very essential. So from that,
it's tough, though, isn't it, Your Excellency, when oil is at 40, because Saudi Arabia doesn't necessarily have the willingness or the ability to project its foreign policy in the ways that it has in the past. Well, does that mean that the UAE is taking more on its shoulders?
No. The UAE will never work alone in any theater. We've worked with NATO and with the United States and Afghanistan. We've worked also with the international community and stabilization in the Balkans. We worked with NATO in the effort to save the Libyan people after Colonel Gaddafi's surge on Benghazi. We've worked with Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and we're working with other countries such as Egypt and France and others in Libya. All this really comes from an understanding that in this new international system, an evolving international system, there is more burden sharing, and you need to be part of those countries that share the burden. But you also have to work with old allies and important allies such as the United States and with regional players, and also send the right messages to countries such as Iran and Turkey and Israel that you are in the region and it is in your interest not to trespass on Arab sovereignty and Arab stability, and that will actually make it better for you and for everybody else involved.
I want to ask you about the U.S. specifically because, granted, we're just a few months away from November 4th, but at the moment, Joe Biden is leading President Trump in the polls. This is a former vice president who was very much for the JCPOA and conversations with Iran with regards to their nuclear program. If there's a move to resuscitate that agreement in the event of a Biden presidency, where does the UAE stand?
I think first of all, the relationship with the United States is a cornerstone of our foreign policy. We have seen Republican governments come, Democratic governments come, and we deal with the United States as an ally and as a friend, and understand also its institutions, and understand also that the United States has its national interest and has its friends. So I would say that we always look at America's engagement in the region as something that is positive. It doesn't mean that we don't have disagreements in how we see things. And in our opinion, this is a very speculative, I would say, question. But we do have our very strong feelings that the JCPOA did not work. And we feel that the region not being part of the process that led to the JCPOA is partly responsible for the JCPOA being interpreted by Iran as a carte blanche for Iran to expand its influence. I hope that Iran has learned from this experience. I think that any review of the Iran policy is something that we will need to deal with at the time. I don't really want to speculate on how American elections will develop. That's an internal American issue. But what I would say that the sum total of our relationship with the United States far outweighs how we look at certain issues differently. And I think that these are things that we can adjust to, we can argue and put across our points. And we think that we have quite convincing arguments in various areas. We seek good relations with all regional players, whether these are Iran, whether it is Turkey, whether it is Israel. But we do have our very, very strong views when it comes to these countries thinking of Arab sovereignty as their, what I would say, geostrategic space, and give themselves the sort of rights to act with impunity in what is essentially the stability of the Arab world.
Your Excellency, this time last year, I was along the coastline in Fujairah reporting on tanker attacks. We were seeing a lot of malign activity coming from the Iranian regime, and certainly we were just a few weeks really away from their attack on Aramco's oil facilities. How would you describe the relationship between the UAE and Iran now?
Well, again, as you know, I mean...
are you in talks?
No, we're not in talks. I mean, there are functional things that take place, and these are, Coast Guard meeting, etc., but none really since COVID-19. I think that Iran has also been, sort of enmeshed in its own COVID issue and so on and so forth. I think what is necessary here is to do several things. Number one is to try, as we move forward, to avoid escalation. I have my issues with Iran, I have my problems with Iran, but at the same time, I think I have an interest in not escalating within the Gulf. The Gulf is not a very big, area of water, and as a result, it is my interest to de-escalate. And I hope also with post-COVID issues, post-COVID priorities coming, I hope that the de-escalation becomes more the norm. Having said that, Iran has to recognize that we do have serious issues. We do have serious issues of an Iran that is expanding and, as you hear, controlling 4 Arab capitals. And now towards Iran, some would say Turkey is trying to control 3 Arab capitals, and I don't know who is trying to control another Arab capital. So clearly, we do have an interest. We do have an interest, but we also need to be quite forward by saying that Iran's policy in the region, its regional policy, its proxies, its missile development policies has been really problematic. And this is something that we need to deal with, and we need to deal with effectively. And it is in our interest for, in the longer term, I don't really see it right now, but it is in our interest to think of a region that is more about everybody's stability and more about everybody's sovereignty and more about everybody's prosperity. We're not there yet, but I think the message of disagreements being dealt with, and this is why we are very much supportive of Iran engaging in various calls by the United States for negotiations, because we do really need to sort this out. And for us, we can't sit there and say we're not worried about Iran's regional policy, and we are not worried about Iran's ballistic missile program. We are very worried because we've seen these regional policies responsible for a lot of instability in the region. And we've seen these missiles being used in various nefarious activities in our region. We have to be frank with that. But at the same time, we share the same region, and we would like to resolve these issues politically. And we would like to resolve these issues where, as I said, we have a shared prosperity and shared stability.
When you think about this with regards to the broader region, one country that is very much in the crosshairs economically is, of course, Lebanon. Iran has a great interest there via Hezbollah. How dangerous do you feel the situation in Lebanon really is today?
Well, I think very worrying, to be honest. We've seen an accumulation of problems in Lebanon, and we've seen also a dictation, really, of the political discourse by Hezbollah, which really has an army within the state. But on the other hand, also the current economic meltdown is very worrying. And, the inability, really, of Lebanon to deal with this economic meltdown is also worrying. I think what has not helped Lebanon also, that's not the whole picture, is that Lebanon over the last 10 years has not really been able to successfully maintain its bridges with the Arab world and with the Gulf. And we've sent over the years many messages to Lebanese politicians, including the current administration in Lebanon.
You've sent also a lot of economic support.
Over the years, of course, but we've sent also messages that, do not really polarize Lebanon within Arab to Arab confrontations. You need to sort of secure yourself, because the time will come when you will need these bridges, and if you burn these bridges, it'll be very difficult for you to use really the huge reservoir of goodwill and the huge reservoir of financial support that Lebanon needs.
In terms of that financial support, do you believe that the UAE will send funds to Lebanon to help bail them out?
Well, again, I mean, the UAE's position has been very clear on this, and we have been.
I mean, if that's the only way to avoid a potential tinderbox kind of conflict.
Again, as I said, we've been very clear, and our position is, as I said before, we don't act alone. We are always part of a coalition and a group of friends and partners, and we will work and be a full partner in this. So clearly, if we see some of our friends, our major powers that are interested in Lebanon, working in a plan, we will consider that. But up to now, as I said, what we're really seeing here is a deterioration of Lebanon's Arab relations and Gulf relations over the last 10 years. And Lebanon is partly paying the price of that right now.
We're just days away from the July 1 deadline that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had set for the annexation of 132 West Bank settlements, as well as the Jordan Valley. Do you believe if they go ahead with that plan, it would be a crime?
Well, again, it'll be a disaster. It'll be a disaster because the whole world, we are bound by the Arab peace plan. We are part of 21, 22 Arab countries that are bound by that plan. So we have done everything we can over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and engaged ferociously, diplomatically, to make it clear that a country that is moderate, such as the UAE, is very, very concerned. It is very concerned because the whole consensus, really, of a two-state solution, the whole consensus of a negotiated settlement will be broken down by these unilateral actions. And, again, we've sent all the right messages. I mean, it was unprecedented, really, for our ambassador to the United States to write.
To attend the meeting at the White House initially for the Kushner
and
plan.
And then to write to in the Israeli press to send that very, very clear message. I've also had my own interviews also, and all our purpose was to do what we can. I mean, again, at the end of the day, what decides really the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian issue is the Israelis and Palestinians, and the countries that are bordering Israel and countries like the United States. But the UAE really has been very vocal in warning against this step. And I say it again here, this will be a total disaster, and we're urging really the Israeli government and urging the Israeli public to reconsider and to look beyond the sort of immediate gratification that certain groups, their ideology brings, and think really long-term. Think long-term, whether they really do want a more stable and Israeli-Palestinian issue, or do they really want to come down the road and look at a single state really with equal rights, which is, in my opinion, something that will be really the dominant debate if we move along this line.
Is the Israeli-Palestinian issue the last hurdle really to, frankly, not just a dialogue, but a normalization of relations with the Arabian Gulf, with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia? If they get past that hurdle, if they solve that issue, could we see an opening up of relations?
I mean, again here, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is a major, major fault line in the region. But as we have seen also over the last decade or so, there are other major issues. So to try and discount the issue, I think, is wrong. But to try also to put the issue as the only issue of real interest in the region is also wrong. I think the UAE, like many other countries, I mean, Israel today has active relations with Egypt, and Jordan, and Turkey, and Qatar, and many, many other countries. And I think the UAE recognizes that. And I think the UAE is also coming and moving forward and saying, and I've said this before, that lines of communication are vital because we can do more with open line of communications than the total rejection that we have seen over the last 30, 40 years. And from that perspective, I think it is essential. And I think also when you really look at the UAE's message against the annexation of Palestinian lands and adding these annexed lands to the Israeli occupation, it is important and essential to see that the Israelis are really taking notice in their press, in their public opinion, and in their elite policy circles. And I think this is the sort of thing that you can bring here, and it is important that we can bring that.
And finally, sir, I want to ask you specifically about China. China today is the second biggest source of foreign direct investment in the UAE, and they are your biggest trading partner. When I asked this question of His Excellency Yusuf Ateba, the ambassador to Washington, he essentially said that there were raised eyebrows in the corridors of power there about the growing relationship between the UAE and China. Is it possible, do you think, that the UAE could act as a bridge of sorts, given the frankly hostile conversations we're seeing between Beijing and Washington today?
Well, again, I mean, I would say that the UAE's concern over this hostile confrontation is a global concern. We're not alone here. Everybody, or almost everybody, has a huge financial and investment and trade relations with China, investment and trade relations with China. We're not alone here, and we're not unique here. And at the same time, like many, many countries in the world, we all recognize that America has the largest really network of allies in the world, and we consider ourselves an important ally for the United States. So clearly, we see this confrontation. It worries us. We would like to see a more, I would say, cooperative relationship between Washington and Beijing. I have to say that our reading is it doesn't look so, but we will have to balance and manage, and it is very difficult. I would say right now, perhaps we are managing like many, many other countries, but more and more, I think we look at that and see that this will be a major, major issue. Every time we see confrontation between Washington and Beijing, the markets actually tremble and the markets are affected. And clearly, I would say that competition between these two giants will continue. And sometimes you would come and say also, to a certain extent, it'll be natural. But I think we have an interest that this competition is more nuanced, and that this competition is at the same time does not really shake what is already a very weak international system. So I would, I would not exaggerate and say that this is a balancing act that not only the UAE, but I would say the majority of countries in the world will have to deal with. And we're hoping that there is a certain stability in this very important relationship between Washington and Beijing.
When you think about the challenges facing the world post-COVID-19, even as we continue to see resurgences of this virus around the world and governments grappling, frankly, to tackle them, what do you see as the single greatest challenge here? Is it this standoff between Washington and Beijing? Is it the abilities of governments to tackle the economic fallout from what we're seeing playing out right now across the world? Or is it closer to home?
Well, again, as you know, I mean, you've sort of categorized them. I think the return to normalcy, whatever that means, will be a challenge. And the return to normalcy is not only economic. It's about kids going back to school. It's about people taking the fear of pandemics, and for us as an international system to be better equipped to deal with any sort of public health issues such as the one that we have faced. But I think in the region here, also, it is important that conflictual politics as usual doesn't return. I mean, again, I don't really see COVID-19 as a magical wand that will change the region and will change relationships between the region. But what I'm really hoping for is that it will actually bring ascendancy to issues such as de-escalation, ascendancy to resolving conflict politically rather than through military means, increasing, for example, regional cooperation. If we can achieve some of these what I would say stretch targets that will actually improve conditions, I'll be very happy with.
Your Excellency, do you still consider Saudi Arabia to be one of your closest allies, given the recent events with the moves in the oil market? That caught a lot of folks off guard, I know.
Saudi Arabia, our prosperity and security is tied to Saudi Arabia's stability, prosperity, and security. And I don't see any way that the UAE prosperity and security can be cut off from Saudi Arabia's, stability, security, etc. I always repeat a story of a very important Saudi delegation coming here to see Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, and I was attending, and it was the late Prince Saud Al Faisal who headed that, with a strategic message from King Abdullah, God bless his soul. And Prince Saud started with complimentary comments about the UAE, its development, etc. And what Sheikh Mohammed said in that important meeting, in the beginning of the meeting, still rings true. And he said, Prince Saud, thank you very much, but we wouldn't have been able to achieve what we have been able to achieve if Saudi Arabia was unstable. So clearly for us, Saudi Arabia is one of our most important relationships, one of our most important allies. And essentially for Saudi Arabia to be, whether it's good times, whether it's bad times, our stability and our prosperity is tied hand in gloves with Saudi Arabia.
So the economics of it doesn't concern you?
The economics of it are important. We can discuss it. But, the sort of history and geostrategic and geography and political system and so on and so forth, I just don't see how the region, the Gulf region, can be stable and prosperous if Saudi Arabia is not.
Your Excellency, we have to wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining CNBC.